The station lights flickered as Captain Jake Morrison walked through the crowded corridors of Kepler-7. The massive trading post hung in the void between three star systems, a neutral ground where dozens of alien species came to trade, negotiate, and sometimes hide from their problems. Jake had been here many times before, but today felt different. The air seemed thick with tension, and conversations stopped when he passed. Jake was a simple man from Earth, raised on stories his grandfather told about knights and heroes from the old days. His grandfather had been a history teacher who believed that honor and courage were not just words in dusty books, but real things that people could live by. Jake carried those lessons with him even now, serving as captain of the human exploration vessel Starbound. He was not the biggest or strongest officer in the fleet, but his crew trusted him because he always tried to do what was right. The lower decks of Kepler-7 were darker and more cramped than the upper levels where the wealthy traders conducted their business. Here, refugees and the desperate tried to scratch out a living in the shadows. Jake was heading to the maintenance bay to check on some repairs when he heard the screaming. Around a corner, he saw a scene that made his blood run cold. A family of Zilani refugees huddled against a wall while 5 Vorthic raiders circled them like predators. The Zilani were peaceful, plant-like beings who had fled their homeworld during the recent wars. The father tried to shield his mate and 2 small children with his thin arms, but the Vorthic laughed at his efforts. The Vorthic were known throughout the galaxy as brutal pirates and slavers. They were tall, reptilian creatures with sharp claws and no sense of mercy. Their leader, a scarred brute with missing teeth, held a plasma cutter that hummed with deadly energy. He was speaking in broken galactic standard, demanding that the family hand over their few possessions. Jake looked around for station security. He spotted them about 50 meters away, crouched behind a barrier and watching the scene through their scopes. They made no move to help. Jake knew the rules of neutral stations like Kepler-7. Security forces were not allowed to interfere in disputes between different species unless the station itself was threatened. The Zilani family was on their own. The Vorthic leader raised his plasma cutter toward the smallest Zilani child. The little one whimpered in fear, and something inside Jake snapped. He thought of his grandfather's words from long ago. A knight protects those who cannot protect themselves. Jake had never called himself a knight, but in that moment, he understood what his grandfather meant. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake stepped out from behind the corner and walked toward the raiders. He had only his standard issue, sidearm and a stubborn refusal to watch innocent people suffer. The Vorthic noticed him approaching and turned their weapons in his direction. "Human, this is not your concern," the leader hissed. "Walk away or join them in death." Jake stopped about 10 meters away and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Let them go. Take me instead." The Vorthic laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "1 human against 5 Vorthok? You must be insane." "Maybe," Jake replied, drawing his weapon. "But I won't stand by and watch you hurt children." The first Vorthok rushed at him with claws extended. Jake rolled to the side and fired twice, dropping the attacker. The others spread out, trying to surround him. Jake moved to keep his back to the wall, protecting the Zilani family behind him. A plasma bolt seared past his ear, leaving a smoking hole in the metal behind him. The fight was brutal and quick. Jake was skilled, but the Vorthak were stronger and had better weapons. He managed to wound 2 more before a claw raked across his arm, tearing through his uniform and drawing blood. The pain was intense, but he kept fighting. The leader came at him with the plasma cutter, swinging it like a sword. Jake ducked under the weapon and tackled the raider, driving both of them to the ground. They rolled across the deck, fighting for control of the cutter. Jake felt the alien's claws digging into his back, but he held on. With a desperate surge of strength, Jake managed to turn the plasma cutter around and fire it into the raider's chest. The Vorthak leader collapsed, and the remaining attackers fled into the darkness of the lower decks. Jake stood slowly, breathing hard and bleeding from multiple wounds. The Zilani family approached him cautiously. The father, an elderly being with bark-like skin and gentle eyes, looked at the wounded human with something like amazement. "What manner of warrior are you?" the Zilani asked in accented galactic standard. Jake wiped blood from his lip, and looked at the family he had saved. The children were safe, and that was all that mattered. "Just a man trying to do what's right," he replied. The Zilani elder studied him for a long moment. "In our ancient texts we have stories of such beings, warriors who fought not for conquest or glory, but to protect the innocent. We thought they were only legends." Jake helped the family gather their scattered belongings. As they prepared to leave, the elder placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have given us more than our lives, human. You have given us hope that such warriors still exist." As Jake watched the family disappear into the crowds of the station, he had no idea that his actions would change the course of galactic history. He had simply done what his grandfather had taught him was right. But sometimes doing what is right is exactly what the galaxy needs most. The story of what happened on Kepler-7 spread through the galaxy faster than anyone expected. In the age of instant communication, news traveled at the speed of light across the void. But this story was different from the usual reports of trade disputes and political meetings. This was about a human who had risked everything to save strangers, and people everywhere wanted to know more. Lieutenant Amy Collins was drinking coffee in the mess hall of the patrol ship Victory when she first heard about Jake Morrison. The ship's communications officer was reading the report aloud to anyone who would listen. Amy had served in the human fleet for 8 years, and she had never heard of anything like this happening before. "He just walked up to 5 armed raiders and told them to let the family go," the communications officer said with amazement in his voice. "No backup, no plan, just his sidearm and a lot of courage." Amy found herself thinking about the story for days afterward. She had grown up hearing tales from her grandmother about the old days on Earth, when people called knights rode across the land to protect the innocent. Amy had always thought those stories were just fairy tales, but now she wondered if there might be some truth to them. Her chance to find out came 3 weeks later, when pirates attacked a medical convoy in the Tau Ceti system. The convoy was carrying supplies to a colony world that had been hit by a plague. The official response from Fleet Command was that they would investigate the attack and file a report. Meanwhile, the medical supplies floated in space while the colony world suffered. Amy could not stand the thought of sick people dying while bureaucrats filled out forms. She remembered Jake Morrison's story and made a decision that would change her life forever. She put in for emergency leave and took her personal fighter to the attack site. She was not alone. Word had spread through the underground networks about what she planned to do, and 12 other humans showed up with their own ships. They were miners, traders, and off-duty military personnel who had heard the same stories Amy had heard. None of them knew each other well, but they all understood what needed to be done. The pirate base was hidden in an asteroid field, protected by automated defenses and a small fleet of attack ships. Amy's group was outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something the pirates did not have. They had a reason to fight that went beyond money or glory. The battle was fierce and desperate. Amy's fighter took heavy damage in the first few minutes, but she kept fighting. She watched as 2 of her companions were shot down, their ships exploding in brilliant flashes of light. But the others pressed on, driven by the knowledge that innocent people were counting on them. In the end, they won. The pirates retreated into deep space, leaving behind the stolen medical supplies and a lot of questions about who these crazy humans were and why they fought so hard for strangers. Amy returned to her regular duties, but she found that word of her actions had spread even further than Jake Morrison's story. Humans throughout the galaxy were talking about something they called the New Code, a set of principles based on the old stories of knights and honor on Mars. A retired Marine colonel named Ben Hayes was already putting these ideas into practice. Ben had served in 3 wars and seen enough death to last several lifetimes. He had retired to a quiet farm in the Red Planet's agricultural zone, hoping to spend his remaining years in peace. But when he heard about Jake and Amy, he realized that his fighting days were not over. Ben started small, teaching self-defense classes to the local farmers. But the classes quickly became something more. He began talking about the old warrior codes, about the idea that strength should be used to protect the weak rather than to dominate them. His students were mostly young people who had grown up hearing stories about Earth's ancient heroes but had never thought they could be heroes themselves. The training was hard and the standards were high. Ben did not just teach his students how to fight. He taught them when to fight and, more importantly, when not to fight. He told them that true strength came not from superior weapons or numbers, but from an unbreakable commitment to do what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Word of Ben's school spread throughout the human colonies. Soon, similar schools were opening on other worlds. The teachers were veterans, historians, and ordinary people who had decided that the galaxy needed more heroes. They called themselves knights, borrowing the ancient title from Earth's past, but the movement was not limited to humans. On the crystal world of Praxis, a young Zelani named Voss began teaching his own people about the human concept of honor. Voss was the son of the elder who had been saved by Jake Morrison, and he had never forgotten the humans' words about doing what was right. The Zelani had always been a peaceful people, but they had also been helpless when stronger races threatened them. Voss believed that his people could learn from the humans without losing their gentle nature. He taught them that violence was sometimes necessary to protect the innocent, but it should always be the last resort. Other species began to take notice as well. The ethereals, ancient beings of pure energy, remembered their own warrior traditions from millions of years ago. The lithoids, living rock creatures, spoke of the stone guardians who had once protected their homeworld from invaders. Even the proud avians, who had always considered themselves above such primitive concepts, began to wonder if there might be wisdom in the human way. The governments of the galaxy watched these developments with growing concern. The Galactic Council had maintained order for thousands of years through careful diplomacy and controlled force. The idea of independent warriors following their own code of honor was dangerous to their carefully balanced system, but the knights were not trying to overthrow governments or start revolutions. They simply wanted to help people who had nowhere else to turn. When the official response to a crisis was too slow or too cautious, the knights acted. They rescued refugees, fought pirates, and protected colonies on the frontier where government forces rarely went. Amy Collins found herself at the center of this growing movement. She had started as a simple patrol officer who wanted to help sick people get medicine. Now she was being called a knight, and people throughout the galaxy were following her example. She was not sure she was ready for such responsibility, but she knew that the galaxy needed people who were willing to stand up for what was right. Commander Lisa Stone stood on the bridge of her small patrol ship as it approached the frontier world of New Geneva. The planet was nothing special, just another agricultural colony on the edge of human space. But Lisa had chosen it for a very specific reason. Here, far from the political games of the inner worlds, she could build something new. Lisa had been following the Knight movement since its beginning. She had read every report about Jake Morrison and Amy Collins, and she had spent months studying the old Earth histories that Ben Hayes used in his training programs. She understood that the galaxy needed more than individual heroes acting alone. It needed an organization that could train, support, and coordinate the efforts of those who chose to follow the Knight's path. The colony governor of New Geneva was a practical man named Robert Clark who cared more about results than regulations. When Lisa explained her plan to establish the first official Knight chapter, he listened carefully. The frontier worlds were always short on security, and the government forces were spread too thin to provide adequate protection. If the Knights could help keep his people safe, he was willing to let them try. Lisa's first recruits were an unlikely group. There was Marcus Webb, a former cargo pilot who had lost his ship defending a refugee convoy. Sarah Blake was a young engineer who had grown up hearing stories about Earth's ancient warriors. Tom Rogers had been a security guard on a space station until he watched pirates attack helpless travelers while his supervisors ordered him to do nothing. Each of them had reached the same conclusion that Lisa had: sometimes doing what was right was more important than following orders. The training was harder than any of them expected. Lisa had studied every fighting manual she could find, from ancient sword techniques to modern space combat tactics. But more important than the physical training was the mental preparation. She taught her recruits that being a knight meant more than just being good at fighting. It meant being willing to sacrifice everything for people they had never met. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. The hegemony of Carthel was a military empire that had been expanding steadily for decades. They believed that might made right, and they took whatever they wanted from weaker civilizations. Their latest target was the peaceful world of Harmony, a planet inhabited by gentle farmers who had never heard anyone. The official response from the Galactic Council was predictable. They sent diplomats to negotiate while the Carthel fleet moved into position around Harmony. The negotiations dragged on for weeks while the planet's population waited in terror. Finally, the Council announced that they had reached a compromise. The Carthel would be allowed to establish military bases on Harmony. In exchange for leaving the civilians alone, Lisa knew that this compromise was worthless. The Carthel had never kept their word before, and they would not start now. Once their forces were on the planet, they would do whatever they wanted with the population. She made a decision that would define the Knight movement for generations to come, against direct orders from her superiors. Lisa took her 30 volunteers and headed for Harmony. Their ships were old and their weapons were outdated, but they had something that the Carthel military did not have. They had a cause worth dying for. The Carthel fleet was massive, over 200 ships of various sizes. Lisa's small force should have been destroyed in minutes. But the Knights had advantages that did not show up on military scanners. They were fighting to protect innocent people, not to gain territory or resources. That gave them a focus and determination that their enemies could not match. The battle began badly for the Knights. 3 of their ships were destroyed in the first few minutes, and Lisa's own vessel took heavy damage. But instead of retreating, the Knights pressed forward. They used tactics that no military academy taught, sacrificing their own safety to protect the evacuation ships that were trying to reach the planet's surface. Something unexpected happened as the battle continued. Ships from other species began to arrive to join the fight. The crew of a Zelani merchant vessel had heard the distress calls and decided to help. A squadron of ethereal fighters appeared out of nowhere, their energy weapons tearing through the Carthel formation. Even some humans from the regular fleet disobeyed orders and joined the battle. The sight of these volunteers, risking everything for strangers, had a powerful effect on others who were watching. Across the galaxy, people who had grown tired of endless negotiations and political compromises saw something they had almost forgotten existed. They saw courage in action, and they wanted to be part of it. The Carthel commander was a veteran of many battles, but he had never faced anything like this before. His forces were superior in every measurable way, but the Knights and their allies kept fighting no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. Worse, his own troops were beginning to question why they were attacking people who were only trying to help civilians. The turning point came when Lisa's damaged ship made a desperate run at the Carthel flagship. She had no chance of survival, but her sacrifice allowed the evacuation fleet to reach the planet's surface. As her ship exploded against the enemy's shields, something broke inside the Carthel ranks. Soldiers who had signed up to conquer worlds found themselves wondering if they were on the wrong side. The battle for Harmony lasted 3 days. In the end, the Carthel fleet withdrew, but not because they had been defeated by superior firepower. They retreated because they could no longer stomach fighting people who cared more about protecting others than protecting themselves. The evacuation was a complete success. Every civilian on Harmony was safely transported to other worlds before the Carthel could reach them. The cost was high. Lisa Stone and 15 other Knights gave their lives in the battle, but their sacrifice proved something important to the galaxy. It proved that courage and honor were not just pretty words from old stories. They were real forces that could change the course of history. The Knights had shown that a small group of people who truly believed in something could stand against impossible odds and win. News of the battle spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. People who had never heard of the Knights before suddenly wanted to know everything about them. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers from dozens of species. The movement that had started with one man's decision to help strangers had become something much larger. But with growth came new challenges. The Galactic Council was no longer content to ignore the Knights. They saw them as a threat to the carefully balanced order that had maintained peace for thousands of years. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The crystal spires of Nexus Prime reached toward the stars like frozen music. The planet was home to the crystalline people, beings of living mineral who communicated through harmonic vibrations that could shatter glass or sing lullabies. For thousands of years, they had been known throughout the galaxy as philosophers and artists, not warriors. But that was about to change. Shard-Singer-of-Truth was young by crystalline standards, only 300 years old. She had spent most of her life studying the ancient poems and songs of her people, believing that wisdom came through contemplation rather than action. Then she watched the recordings of the Battle of Harmony, and everything changed. The sight of humans dying to protect strangers from a completely different species made no logical sense to her analytical mind. But something deeper than logic was stirring in her crystalline heart. She remembered fragments of old songs, verses that spoke of crystal guardians who had once protected her world from invaders. Those stories had been dismissed as primitive mythology, but now she wondered if they contained forgotten truths. Shard-Singer-of-Truth was not alone in her thoughts. Across the galaxy, other species were having similar reactions to the human Knights. The battle had awakened something that had been sleeping in the collective memory of civilization. Ancient warrior traditions that had been buried beneath layers of modern cynicism were suddenly relevant again. Dr. Greg Palmer was a xenobiologist who had spent his career studying alien cultures. He had joined the Knights after witnessing a pirate attack on a research station, but his real contribution came from his deep understanding of how different species thought and fought. He realized that the human concept of knighthood could be adapted to work with alien psychology, but it would require careful study and patience. Greg's first breakthrough came when he met Shard-Singer-of-Truth during a diplomatic mission to Nexus Prime. The crystalline had requested human advisors to help them understand the Knight movement, but Greg quickly realized that she already understood it better than most humans. She had instinctively grasped the core principles and was working to translate them into terms that her people could accept. The crystalline Knight chapter was unlike anything that had come before. Where human Knights emphasized individual courage and personal sacrifice, the crystallines focused on harmony and collective action. They fought in perfect coordination, their movements synchronized like a deadly dance. Their weapons were tuned to specific frequencies that could shatter enemy armor or disable electronic systems without harming living beings. Shard-Singer-of-Truth became the first non-human Knight commander, and her example inspired others throughout the galaxy. The avians, proud bird-like beings who lived in the clouds of gas giants, embraced the concept of swift justice. Their Knights moved like lightning, striking at evil wherever they found it and disappearing before their enemies could react. The Lithoids were massive rock creatures who had always been slow to anger but impossible to stop once they started moving. Their interpretation of knighthood focused on absolute defense. A Lithoid Knight would plant themselves between danger and innocence, becoming an immovable wall that no force could breach. Their motto was simple: none shall pass. The Ethereals were perhaps the most surprising converts to the Knight movement. These ancient beings of pure energy had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations over millions of years. They had seen every form of government and every type of warrior, and they had concluded that nothing really mattered in the long run. But the human Knights had shown them something they had forgotten: that individual actions could have meaning even in an infinite universe. The ethereal Knights became the wise counselors of the movement. They used their vast experience to guide younger Knights and their energy forms to reach places that physical beings could not go. They specialized in rescuing people from disasters and providing healing to those who had been hurt in the struggle between good and evil. But the growth of the Knight movement was not without problems. The Galactic Council watched with growing alarm as more species abandoned their traditional roles in galactic society. The careful balance of power that had maintained peace for millennia was being disrupted by these idealistic warriors who refused to follow the established rules. Senator Claire Mitchell had been a knight herself before entering politics. She had joined the movement during its early days and had fought alongside Lisa Stone in several battles. But her election to the Galactic Council had forced her to put aside her knight's oath and work within the system. She had hoped to change things from the inside, but she was learning that the system was more resistant to change than she had expected. The breaking point came when the Council formally declared the Knights to be a terrorist organization. The vote was close, but the fear of losing control was stronger than any admiration for the Knights' noble goals. The declaration meant that any government that supported the Knights would face economic sanctions and military action. Claire stood in the great assembly hall of the Galactic Council, looking out at the representatives of hundreds of worlds. These were supposed to be the leaders of civilization, the people who made the difficult decisions that kept the galaxy running. But all she saw were frightened politicians who cared more about their own power than about the people they were supposed to serve. The debate had been going on for hours. Speaker after speaker had risen to condemn the Knights as dangerous extremists who threatened the stability of galactic society. They spoke of law and order, of the need for central authority, of the chaos that would result if every individual felt free to take justice into their own hands. Claire had heard enough. She rose from her seat and walked to the center of the hall. The chamber fell silent as she removed the insignia of her office and placed it on the speaker's podium. Her voice was calm but carried clearly to every corner of the vast room. "I swear to protect the innocent," she said, speaking the ancient oath that had become the foundation of the Knight movement. "I swear to defend the helpless. I swear to stand against tyranny wherever it may arise." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of colleagues who had once called her friend. "If that makes me a terrorist, then I am proud to be one." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, other representatives began to stand. Some were humans who had been knights before entering politics. Others were aliens who had been inspired by the movement to seek office. One by one, they repeated Claire's words and removed their own insignia. By the time the session ended, over a third of the Galactic Council had resigned their positions. The carefully constructed government that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years was falling apart. But something new was being born from its ruins. The species that had embraced the Knight movement began to form their own alliances. They created new governments based on the principles of honor and service rather than power and control. The galaxy was splitting into two camps. Those who believed in the old ways and those who had found something better. Greg Palma found himself at the center of this transformation. His work in adapting knighthood to different species had created a new kind of civilization, one where beings who had been enemies for millennia could work together toward common goals. It was not perfect, and there were still conflicts and misunderstandings. But for the first time in galactic history, there was hope that different species could truly become friends rather than just temporary allies. The stage was set for the final confrontation between the old order and the new. The Knights had proven that their ideas could inspire people across the galaxy. Now they would have to prove that those ideas were strong enough to survive the coming storm. The galaxy was burning, not with fire, but with the flames of revolution that spread from world to world as governments fell and new ones took their place. The old order that had ruled for thousands of years was crumbling, and those who had profited from its corruption were not going to give up without a fight. Commander Rick Turner stood on the command bridge of Avalon Station, watching the sensor readings with growing concern. The station had been built in the neutral zone between human space and the core worlds, designed to be a training center and headquarters for the Knight movement. Now it was about to become the site of the most important battle in galactic history. The combined fleet approaching them was unlike anything Rick had ever seen. Ships from the Galactic Council flew alongside vessels from the most brutal criminal organizations in the galaxy. The Syndicate, the Black Stars, the Vorthik Raiders, and dozens of other groups had put aside their differences to join forces against the Knights. It was a desperate alliance born of fear and greed. But it was also the largest military force ever assembled. Rick was not a trained military commander. He had been a teacher on Earth before joining the Knights, and his experience with space combat was limited to the small skirmishes that had become common as the movement grew. But he had been chosen to lead the defense of Avalon Station because he understood something that traditional military officers did not. He understood that the Knights were not just fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for the right to exist. The station's defenders were equally unlikely. There were barely 300 Knights from a dozen different species, supported by whatever volunteers had been able to reach the station before the enemy fleet arrived. They had old ships, outdated weapons, and no chance of victory in a conventional battle. But they had something their enemies did not have. They had a cause worth dying for. The siege began at dawn, Galactic Standard Time. The enemy fleet formed a perfect sphere around Avalon Station, trapping the defenders inside a cage of deadly firepower. Their commander, Admiral Kane of the Galactic Council, had planned the assault with mathematical precision. He would starve the station into submission, cutting off all supplies and communications until the Knights had no choice but to surrender. Rick's response was to open the station's communication channels to the entire galaxy. Instead of hiding their desperate situation, he broadcast everything that was happening. People throughout the galaxy could watch as a small group of idealistic warriors, prepared to make their final stand against overwhelming odds. The first day passed quietly. The enemy fleet maintained its position while the defenders waited for the attack that never came. Rick used the time to speak with his people, moving through the station's corridors and talking to every Knight he could find. He did not give speeches about victory or glory. Instead, he reminded them why they had chosen this path in the first place. The second day brought the first real assault. Squadrons of fighters swept in from all directions, testing the station's defenses and probing for weaknesses. The Knights fought back with everything they had, but they were badly outnumbered. By the end of the day, they had lost half their ships and a third of their people. On the third day, enemy Marines attempted to board the station. The fighting was brutal and hand-to-hand as Knights from different species stood side by side in the narrow corridors. Shard Singer of Truth led a group of crystalline warriors in a desperate defense of the main reactor. Marcus Webb, the former cargo pilot, sacrificed himself to seal a breach in the station's hull. The fourth day was the worst. The enemy brought up their heavy weapons and began systematically destroying the station's defenses. Whole sections were blown away, taking dozens of Knights with them. Rick himself was wounded when a plasma blast tore through the command bridge, but he refused to leave his post. By the fifth day, the defenders were running out of ammunition and hope. The station's shields were failing, and the enemy was preparing for a final assault. Rick gathered the surviving Knights in the main assembly hall and prepared to give what he thought would be his final speech. But something unexpected was happening throughout the galaxy. People who had been watching the siege were beginning to understand what they were really seeing. This was not a battle between two military forces. This was a small group of heroes making a stand against everything that was wrong with the galaxy. On the sixth day, the miracle began. Ships started arriving from every corner of known space. They came alone and in small groups, ignoring the enemy fleet that surrounded the station. These were not military vessels but civilian ships crewed by ordinary people who had decided they could not stand by and watch the Knights die. The enemy admiral ordered his forces to stop the approaching vessels. But something unprecedented happened. His own crews began to refuse orders. Soldiers who had grown up hearing stories about the Knights found themselves unable to fire on the very people they had once admired. Mutinies broke out on ship after ship as the rank and file rebelled against their officers. The turning point came when the crew of the flagship itself rose up against Admiral Kane, the ship's captain. A young woman named Elena Cross had been a Knight before joining the regular fleet. She had hidden her past to advance her career, But watching the siege of Avalon Station had reminded her of who she really was. Elena led her crew in taking control of the flagship and opening fire on the criminal vessels in the enemy fleet. Other ships quickly followed her example, turning their weapons on the pirates and slavers who had been their allies just moments before. The carefully organized assault dissolved into chaos as the fleet tore itself apart. A seventh day brought the end of the siege. The surviving criminal ships fled into deep space while the former council vessels requested permission to dock at Avalon Station. Their crews lined up to take the knight's oath, asking for forgiveness and the chance to serve something greater than themselves. Rick Turner stood once again on the command bridge, looking out at the wreckage of what had once been the galaxy's most powerful fleet. The station was badly damaged and many good people had died, but they had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had won not through superior firepower or clever tactics, but through the simple power of moral example. The siege of Avalon Station became the symbol of everything the Night Movement represented. It showed that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were willing to sacrifice for others. It proved that courage and honor were not just pretty words but real forces that could change the course of history, but more than that, it demonstrated that the galaxy was ready for a new kind of leadership. The old system of government by committee and rule by compromise had failed. People wanted leaders who would put justice before politics and service before self-interest. The Knights had shown them that such leaders were possible. The war was not over yet. There were still those who clung to the old ways and would fight to preserve their power. But the tide had turned at Avalon Station. The galaxy had seen what the Knights were really fighting for, and it had chosen to stand with them. The age of knighthood was about to begin. 5 years had passed since Jake Morrison first spoke the words that would change the galaxy forever. The man who had once been just a simple ship captain now stood as Knight Commander of the rebuilt Kepler-7 station, watching as the latest group of recruits prepared to take their oath. The ceremony had become a symbol of hope throughout the galaxy, broadcast to billions of beings who had learned to believe in heroes again. The great assembly hall was filled with representatives from dozens of species. Humans stood beside crystallines, whose harmonic voices added a musical quality to the proceedings. Avians perched on specially designed platforms while lithoids formed a solid wall of living stone at the back of the room. Ethereals floated above the crowd, their energy forms casting gentle light on the faces below. Jake remembered the first time he had witnessed this ceremony, when there had been only a handful of volunteers and everyone thought the Night Movement would fade away like so many other idealistic causes. Now there were thousands of knights serving throughout the galaxy, and their influence had transformed entire civilizations. The galaxy itself had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The old Galactic Council had been dissolved after the siege of Avalon Station, replaced by the Assembly of Worlds. The new government was based on principles that the Knights had fought to establish: service before self, justice before convenience, and the protection of the innocent above all else. Representatives to the Assembly were required to take a modified version of the Knight's Oath before they could serve. They swore to put the welfare of their people before their own ambitions, and to stand against corruption and tyranny wherever they found it. It was not a perfect system, and there were still those who tried to abuse their power, but the Knights were there to watch and intervene when necessary. The newest group of recruits included beings from species that had once been enemies. A young Vorthak named Scartooth knelt beside a Zalani healer, both preparing to swear the same oath of service. The sight would have been impossible just a few years ago, but the Knights had shown that ancient hatreds could be overcome by shared purpose. Jake stepped forward to begin the ceremony. His voice carried clearly through the hall, speaking words that have become sacred to billions of beings throughout the galaxy. Do you swear to protect the innocent, regardless of their species or origin? The response came from hundreds of voices, in dozens of languages, but the meaning was the same. We swear. Do you swear to defend the helpless, even at the cost of your own life? We swear. Do you swear to stand against tyranny and injustice, no matter what form they take? We swear. Jake looked out at the faces before him and saw something that filled him with pride and hope. These were not professional soldiers or trained warriors. They were teachers and farmers, merchants and engineers, students and retirees. They were ordinary people who had decided to become extraordinary. The ceremony concluded with the traditional words that Jake's grandfather had taught him so many years ago. Remember always that a knight's true strength comes not from weapons or armor, but from the courage to do what is right when no one else will. After the ceremony, Jake retreated to his private office to complete his final report. Tomorrow he would step down as knight commander and return to his old life as a ship captain. The movement no longer needed heroes or symbols. It needed ordinary people doing ordinary good work, day after day. Year after year, his report would be read by historians and scholars for generations to come, but Jake kept it simple. He wrote about the people who had inspired him. Amy Collins, who had shown that courage could be contagious. Lisa Stone, who had proven that small groups could accomplish great things. Ben Hayes, who had taught that honor was something you lived, not something you talked about. He wrote about the aliens who had embraced human ideals and made them their own. Shard Singer of Truth, who had brought harmony to conflict. The Avian Knights, who had shown that justice could be swift without being cruel. The Lithoid Guardians, who had demonstrated that some things were worth defending at any cost, but most of all, he wrote about the ordinary people who had chosen to be knights when no one was watching. The cargo pilot who had refused to transport weapons to criminals, the station worker who had stood up to corrupt officials, the teacher who had shown children that heroes were real and that anyone could become one. As Jake finished his report, an emergency signal came through the communication system. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, pirates were attacking a refugee convoy. The official response would take hours to organize, but the knights could be there in minutes. Jake smiled as he heard the familiar sound of ships launching from the station's docking bays. 5 years ago, those refugees would have been on their own, abandoned to face their fate while governments debated and bureaucrats filed reports. Now they had guardians who would risk everything to protect them. The age of cold efficiency and political calculation was over. The age of knights had begun, and with it came something the galaxy had almost forgotten. Hope. In the depths of space, a new distress signal joined the cacophony of voices crying out for help. A mining colony was under attack. A research station had lost contact with the outside world. A medical ship was stranded in hostile territory. Once, these calls would have gone unanswered, lost in the bureaucratic maze of government response procedures. Now they were answered by voices speaking in dozens of languages but carrying the same message. This is Night Patrol responding to your distress call. Help is on the way. Jake Morrison looked out at the stars and thought about his grandfather, who had filled a young boy's head with stories about heroes and honor. The old man had been right. Knights were not just legends from the past. They were a choice that anyone could make, a path that anyone could follow. The galaxy had forgotten what it meant to be a knight, but humans had remembered. And in remembering, they had reminded everyone else that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, and most importantly, worth living for. The knights rode on through the infinite darkness, eternal guardians of light in a universe that had learned to hope again. They were no longer just human heroes fighting human battles. They were something new, a family of warriors from 100 different worlds, united not by blood or politics, but by the simple belief that protecting others was the highest calling any being could answer. The last entry in Jake Morrison's personal log was brief but profound. The galaxy forgot knights, but we brought them back. Not because we were stronger or smarter than anyone else, but because we remembered that heroes are not born. They are made, one choice at a time, one stand at a time, one oath at a time. The age of knights has begun, and it will never end as long as there are those willing to answer the call. In the far reaches of space, where danger still lurked and innocence still needed protection, the knights continued their eternal vigil. They had transformed not just themselves, but the entire galaxy. proving that the greatest victories were won not with weapons or technology, but with courage, honor, and an unshakable commitment to do what was right.